Our next presenter will be Mike Smith, and he will be presenting on the recent UK decision.
I don't know whether that's good news or bad news. But I want to thank NIJ and definitely the FBI for allowing me to come give a presentation here today. I'm probably one of the only non-practicing trace evidence examiners in the room. I started in trace in 1990 and stayed there until 1995. I'm a footwear and tire track examiner in the FBI laboratory, and you're probably wondering, why are you here? In the 2010 UK decision, I was sent an article, by our laboratory director, and it just so happened that a footwear article that I'd published in 2009 just happened to be part of the judge's decision in the UK decision. So I was asked by the Trace Evidence Unit to give a brief presentation on comparing the conclusions of could have versus a likelihood ratio. And I want to kind of go through the steps that I use in my laboratory in conducting the exams, and then compare those to the ones that were used in the UK. So what does your conclusion really mean is really the topic that I want to discuss, but I kind of want to go to it at a different area. In writing your report, we've been here all week discussing all your methods and methodologies to conducting your examinations, but once you have all of those exams conducted, you have to sit down and finally write your report. And I think there's some important steps that we have to take into consideration is to the other side, who's going to be reading those reports? And can your conclusion be misinterpreted? Would the reader or the investigator or the contributor on the other side actually understand what you're putting in your report? And are there any limitations to your examinations that you've conducted? Are those clear in your report? And would the reader of your report actually understand the significance of your findings? In our laboratory, as of last year, I actually sat on a panel. It was a report writing workshop, where now in our laboratory, instead of just writing just a simple one paragraph or one line, your conclusions or your opinions, we're now incorporating into the lab report your conclusions, the methodologies, the interpretation and limitations of the different disciplines. And I think that kind of helps the reader kind of understand a basis for your opinion. So this is why I'm here. In 2010, there was a case, a court decision, RVT, out of the UK. The appeal came down in October of 2010. It involved a homicide, and the defendant was tried and convicted of murder. Just so happened to be involved, it was a footwear comparison, which I know a little about. And what I want to kind of use this case for is the use of a could have and a likelihood ratio in reaching or drawing conclusions in this case, and let you kind of see the difference between the two. In the way that I write a report in a could have, and we have definitely a difference, we have a scale from an identification to an elimination, and we also have a phrase could have made. So when I say that the footwear impression could have, the shoe could have made a particular impression, what I'm looking at are a combination of at least two class characteristics that I can see in common between the question impression and the known shoe. Specifically, I'm looking at the physical size of the impression and comparing that to the shoe. And physical size is different than a shoe size, and I point this out in court. When I make reference to a physical size of an impression, it's the length, the width, and the spatial relationship of the geometric shapes that you can see in the impression, and then comparing that to the outsole of the shoe. I'm also looking at the design, which are both class characteristics. So how important is that in drawing your conclusion? If you look at the significance of a could have made, if you look at the top of the triangle, all the shoes in the world, there's a very large number of footwear that are purchased by people. If you come down to the middle, shoes in the US, and the last figures that I have from Footwear Market Insight or Footwear Industries of America were 2007. Any guesstimates on how many shoes were purchased just in the US? 2.4 billion pair of shoes. Any surprises? So that takes into consideration all of those shoes out of the world and then just the ones that are used or bought in the United States, 2.4 billion pairs. So if you go further down the triangle to the shoes of one design in the US, even if you were to just start with one brand and go with Nike, how many different types of Nike shoes do you think they produce? There is a lot of those as well. So in your examination, if you're finding just that one design, you can eliminate a lot of other footwear as having potentially made that impression. So if you go to shoes of one size and one design, and that's where I'm going to leave it at for could have made. You've got the design and already went through that. The physical size. In, say, potentially the Nike Air Force One, their shoe sizes start at 5.5, and they go all the way up to like 21 or 22. If you just happen to have a correspondence in physical size and design, do you think looking at that, do you think you've been able to eliminate a lot of other shoes as having potentially made that impression? So if you were to just look at my report and I were to state that the footwear impression depicted in the Q1 photograph could have been made by the K1 Nike shoe, do you get all of that information that I just went through in that? When I testify in court, prior to doing that, I'll meet with a prosecutor and go over the significance of my conclusion in the report and the limitations. I can't say specifically that that shoe made the impression, nor would I be able to eliminate it. So you have to point out those factors to the prosecutor so he or she understands exactly what you mean in your report. On the other hand, that's the way that our reports are written. On the flip side of the coin, likelihood ratio. How likely is it to obtain a piece of evidence given one proposition compared to how likely is it to obtain an alternate proposition? Once you've done that, a numerical value is calculated and the strength of support for a proposition can be expressed. It's usually in a numerical number. The opinion that's stated was the one that was given in the UK decision, the private footwear examiner. In my opinion, there is a moderate degree of scientific support for a view that the Nike trainers made those marks. So in using that scale, you'll see moderate degree. This is an example of the likelihood ratio scale. You can see the moderate support of 10 to 100 almost at the second part. And that's how the expression was given. So in the appeal process of this particular case, the judge went through and pointed out some issues with likelihood ratio. The examiner based his opinion on certain factors, and then those factors are used in a formula to reach that 100 to moderate support. The formula that was used is P times C times W times D. And we'll kind of go through what each one of those mean. The P is the frequency of the pattern. In their laboratory, I think it was 8,122 pair of shoes that they had as a reference point. C was the figure, the percentage of the size 11s. I think in the UK at that particular time, 786,000 pairs. So out of those, 3% were size 11s. The W is the amount of wear. And I kind of want to go through this at the end of this. The amount of wear on the shoe meant that half of the shoes of the design and approximate size configuration could be excluded. I would have to, see more info on that one. And then D is the damage that was on the shoe. And when I'm talking about the wear, even the examiner himself noticed that there was considerable more wear on the shoes than was at the crime scene impression. So how do you account for that wear? Well, if it's in my lab and I'm doing the examination, I would ask, number one, the exact date when the crime was committed. Secondly, you want to determine if the information is not given to you when the shoes were collected. Because if there's a large time difference between the date that the crime occurred, the date the shoes collected, that could account for that wear difference. When I write a report and I see that difference in wear, I'll put in there that a difference in wear was observed between the question impression and the known shoe. However, the 3-month time difference between the collection and the crime date could account for that wear difference. And I think you're putting that before the reader that you observe the difference in wear and he or she knows what you're talking about. The damage is considered, you could exclude a few pair of the shoes. I don't know how you put that quantitatively and give it a particular number. As I stated earlier, the footwear data was only used or collected from one laboratory. In the FBI laboratory, anybody that was at the Pattern Impression Symposium last year, I did a lecture on the Nike Air Force One. The Nike Air Force One, I see probably 40 to 50% of the footwear cases that come into our lab. We have a colleague that works in the Maine State Police Crime Lab who very rarely sees that shoe. So if I were to assign a statistical number or a probability of the Air Force One, would that information be reliable if I see it more in my lab than another particular lab conducting the same type of examination? The court further went on to, if there is a more way of expressing an opinion, then it should be done in more than it could have. But in our conclusion scales, we can go all the way up to probably made if I can see more information in the footwear impression and a correspondence on the known shoe. The court also stated that where a sufficiently reliable database is available, as in DNA, then a straight statistical model could properly be used. And at this current time, footwear does not have that. In the outcome of the appeal, the conviction was quashed and a retrial was ordered. So what I wanted to do is kind of give you an idea of how we write our reports in the US in a could have or a positive identification as opposed to adding a likelihood ratio. I mean, I have no problem assigning numbers, and I think anyone that's in an experience-based discipline, a lot of the critics want to see statistical data for you in order to formulate your opinion and to put it in your report. But currently, I do not see a reliable way of adding or putting data in the report to put it in a manner that, number one, would be reliable and that someone could understand. So I know I kind of went through that quickly, but I kind of thought it was important to kind of go through that because just, I have no issue with the likelihood ratio. And I think maybe, at an impression symposium, maybe we could have someone to help interpret the likelihood ratio and compare that to the way we currently write our reports here in the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Are there any questions?
My name's Chris Bomarito, or Chris Bomarito, and I felt compelled to make a few comments. I don't really so much have a question, but first of all, I wanted to actually address an assertion that was made earlier in the conference by Mr. Reisinger, I believe. We American scientists do, for the most part, understand Bayes. We just don't necessarily agree with it. And the reason I'm up here is because my name was thrown out there for a scale that I didn't do. It's not my scale that was really up there, and I really disagree with using the Bayes terminology for these types of scales, and I don't agree with using Bayes when you don't have statistical data to support those assertions. You don't have the numbers. I hear things, people saying that you can do Bayes and you don't need to know statistics. Well, it's not any less subjective than using a scale or drawing conclusions if you don't have that background data. It just sounds less subjective because you're using statistical terms. So that's just my comment. I don't know if any of the panelists have comment on that.
I'd just like to say that I may have misrepresented what Helen meant too. So, I don't know if this were a congressional inquiry, I would say I take the fifth. I don't know.
Are there any other questions, comments? All right, I'd like to thank my presenters for presenting today, as well as thank you for being here today. And the next person to present will be Vinny Desiderio, that will speak in regards to the poster awards.